100,000 years ago. You weren't the only human on Earth. There were at least 6 different human species. Some were stronger than us, some had bigger brains, some survived ice ages long before we did. Today, there is only one. So, what killed everyone else? You are standing in a cave in northern Spain. Nothing moves. Dust hangs in a single shaft of light. And on the wall in front of you, someone has pressed their hand into wet ochre and left it there. A signature, 40,000 years old, from a species that no longer exists. They were not us, not quite, but close enough that if one of them walked past you on a street today, wrapped in modern clothing, you might not look twice. They had fire. They had tools. They buried their dead with flowers and ochre, in at least one case, the wing of an eagle. They had bigger brains than you do, and they are gone. So are the others. All of them. Every branch of the human family tree that was not our own has been quietly, completely erased. And for most of human history, we didn't even know they had existed. We tend to think of ourselves as the inevitable result of evolution, the finished product. But for most of the last 2 million years, we were not alone. There were, at times, half a dozen human species walking the same Earth at once. Different heights, different skulls, different tools, different fires. We were the only ones who made it out. Most people imagine evolution as a straight line. Fish to reptile, reptile to mammal, ape to man, a single tidy arrow pointing at us. That's not what happened. The real picture looks less like an arrow and more like a bush, dozens of branches, sprouting, growing, and dying in the dark, most of them going nowhere at all. Homo erectus, Homo habilis. Homo naledi, discovered so recently that its bones were still being pulled out of a South African cave system while some of us were checking our phones. Homo floresiensis, a species barely a meter tall that lived on a remote Indonesian island until, geologically speaking, a few minutes ago. At one point, at least 6 different human species may have coexisted on Earth simultaneously. 6. Now there is one. That is not a small fact. That is one of the strangest, quietest catastrophes in the story of life on this planet. And almost nobody talks about it, because the survivors get to write the history. For over a century, the story was simple. Neanderthals were the losers, slow, brutish, outcompeted by smarter, more adaptable humans who arrived from Africa and simply outclassed them into extinction. It was a comforting story because it made us the heroes. It was also, largely, wrong. Neanderthal brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. They controlled fire. They made composite tools, wore symbolic ornaments, cared for injured members of their group well enough that some skeletons show healed wounds no lone survivor could have recovered from alone. They buried their dead. And then, sometime after modern humans arrived in Europe, they vanished, over a span of a few thousand years, which sounds long until you remember that our species has existed for roughly 300,000. For decades, scientists searched for the single cause. A war we won, a disease we carried, a famine they couldn't survive. They never found one clean answer. What they found instead was something stranger and more uncomfortable. We didn't just replace the Neanderthals, we absorbed them. Every non-African human being alive today carries Neanderthal DNA. Not metaphorically, literally. Sitting in your cells right now, inherited from interbreeding that happened tens of thousands of years ago, in places and moments we will never be able to name. There was no clean separation between us and them. There was contact. There was mixing. There were children born of 2 different human species, at a moment when neither side could have known they were witnessing the last chapter of a story 10 million years in the making. And then, slowly, the Neanderthal half of that story stopped reproducing on its own terms. Some researchers believe modern humans simply had the numbers, larger, better-connected populations that could recover faster from disaster, absorb losses, replace what was lost. Neanderthal groups, by contrast, appear to have lived in small, isolated bands, fewer people, fewer options, less room for error. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a demographic sentence, handed down so slowly that no single generation would have recognized it as an ending. They weren't defeated. They were diluted out of existence. One small band, one bad winter, one missing generation at a time. If this were only about one species, it would already be unsettling. It is not only about one species. Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit for its extraordinary small stature, survived on the isolated island of Flores until surprisingly recently in the human timeline, isolated long enough to evolve into something almost unrecognizable as human by our standards, then simply stopped appearing in the fossil record. The Denisovans left behind almost no bones at all, a finger fragment, a few teeth. And yet we know they existed, because like the Neanderthals, they too live on inside us. Populations in parts of Asia and Oceania today carry Denisovan DNA passed down from encounters we have almost no direct evidence for. We know an entire human lineage existed, largely because of what it left behind in us, not what it left behind in the ground. Think about that for a moment. We are, in a very real sense, walking archives of extinction, carrying the genetic remains of species we can barely reconstruct, whose faces we will never see, whose languages, if they had them, are gone forever. Here is where the story stops being simply sad and starts being genuinely unsettling. Look closely at the timeline, and a pattern begins to emerge. Almost every other human species disappears not gradually, over millions of years of slow decline, but suddenly, in a narrow window, right around the time modern humans arrive in their territory. Australia. The large-bodied animals vanish shortly after humans arrive. The Americas. The same pattern on a different continent, tens of thousands of years later. Europe. The Neanderthals, gone within a few thousand years of contact. Coincidence, repeated on every continent we have ever colonized, stops behaving like coincidence. We do not know with certainty that we caused these extinctions directly. The evidence is contested, incomplete, argued over in journals to this day. Climate change was shifting the world dramatically during many of these overlaps. Retreating ice, transforming landscapes, stressing populations that were already living on the edge of what their environment could support. But climate alone struggled to explain species that had already survived previous ice ages without disappearing. What changed each time was not only the climate, it was us. If it wasn't intelligence alone, Neanderthals were not unintelligent, then what was it? The honest answer researchers increasingly point to is smaller and stranger than we were smarter. We were more connected. Evidence suggests modern human groups maintained wider social networks, trading materials, and possibly information across distances far greater than other human species appear to have managed. A shell found hundreds of kilometers from any coastline. A stone tool made from materials sourced from a mountain range its owner may never have personally visited. That is not just technology. That is a species that had learned to survive collectively across space in a way no other human lineage seems to have replicated at scale. When crisis came, and crisis always comes, a species with fewer neighbors, fewer trading partners, fewer places to draw people and resources and knowledge from, had less to fall back on. It wasn't a war we won. It was a network we built, quietly, generation after generation, without ever knowing what it would cost the species who didn't build one of their own. Picture the final Neanderthal band. Not a myth. A real, specific, unrecorded moment. A small group in a valley somewhere in Iberia or the Caucasus doing what their ancestors had done for 400,000 years, making fire, watching for weather, raising children who, without ever knowing it, would never grow old enough to raise children of their own. They did not know they were the end of something. No one ever does. That is perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story. Not that other human species died, but how quietly they did it. No single dramatic battle. No apocalyptic event visible from orbit. Just population curves, bending downward, generation after generation, until one day the curve simply reached zero and nobody was left to notice. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, the wise ones, as if wisdom were the reason we're the last ones left. But maybe that's the wrong lesson entirely. Maybe the real story is not that we were the smartest. It's that we were the most connected, the most willing or able to reach beyond our own small group and pull resources, ideas, and people from somewhere else when things got hard. And if that's true, it raises an uncomfortable question about what happens to any population, human or otherwise, that becomes isolated, disconnected, cut off from the wider network that crisis always seems to test. Every other branch of the human family tree learned that lesson too late. We are the only ones who happen to learn it in time, for now. Because if there's one thing the story of every extinct human species actually tells us, it's this. Being human was never a guarantee of survival. It never has been. It still isn't.